Hello friends, and thank you for tuning in. Today I want to talk to you about the five disasters that tend to occur after water changes. I hear these talked about on over at the ben.o.cichlid Facebook group page. Very often the post starts with something like, "My fish were doing great. I did a water change, and now they're dying on me. What's happening?" And unfortunately, this happens too often. And let's talk about it, and be sure to hit that bell and join that convo gang so you too can participate in conversations down below. And I love reading them. I love participating in them when I can. And be sure to subscribe, rate and share, and all that good stuff. I thank you so much for tuning in. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Let's figure out why these disasters occur after water changes, and let's see if there's something we can do about it to be better at it. Thank you so much.
Let's take a look at my tanks, which have just undergone a water change as we go through these. There's my lazy albino bushy-nosed pleco. But number one is the flood. The flood comes because we're distracted during a water change when we're refilling the tank. And this has happened to all of us at some point. You know, you get off on something else. Something as simple as texting somebody or posting something or a phone call while you're filling your tank. And the moral of that lesson, certainly for me, has been when I'm filling a tank, do nothing else except fill the tank. Don't get involved in anything, conversations, texting, or anything else. Yeah, we can all multitask, I get it. But I'll tell you something. You turn around, you think you were not doing something for that long, and you look, and you've got a nice big puddle on the floor. Ask me how I know. Number two water change disaster is the shock. And this is the one that I think is responsible for a lot of the deaths. And this is where you shock your fish with something like an extreme water change, like a water temperature shift, a pH shift, or some ingredient that is in your tap water that you were simply unaware of. And I know that for a lot of us, it's just not practical to test our tap water on an ongoing basis. But sometimes our local, unless you're on a well and you're getting nice, pure, clean, pristine water, the vast majority of us are at the mercy of water treatment plants, and sometimes they decide to add an ingredient because something is going on. Maybe there's flooding, maybe there's rain, too much rain, something going on. They add something extra to the water and it shocks the fish. And all of a sudden you notice unusual behavior and you start to have a die-off. So number two, the shock. Number three is you tried to do too much. You tried to include too much with your water change. And we're going into a super slow-mo here on the fish. This is Apple's slow motion feature, which in some ways I think might be a little bit too slow, but but there it is. At any rate, doing too much, including too much with the water change. You vacuumed, you cleaned your filters, and you even added some stock. And what this does is, of course, you got rid of some of your beneficial bacteria, and the fish are creating more ammonia, more waste between the feeding and everything else than the beneficial bacteria can keep up with. And shortly after that water change, usually within a day, you'll notice erratic behavior and you'll see a die-off on your fish because ammonia is extremely deadly. Nitrite, of course, is also deadly, not as deadly as ammonia, and then of course nitrate, which the fish can tolerate quite a bit. But ammonia, very, very zero tolerance. Keep that number at 0. For those of you who test your water, it must be at 0. So this sort of ties into number 4. Number 4, you forgot to treat. You forgot to treat the water that was being added to your tank. Some of you will add some type of a treatment like Prime or a Safe, things like this, to a bucket of water and then add that water to the tank. In other words, you pre-treat. A lot of us, like myself, will run an Aquarium or a Python system from a tap directly into the tank, in which case you need to treat for the entire volume of your system. For example, on my sump system on the 150, I have probably a total water volume of over maybe around 170 gallons when you consider the sump. But you also have to consider that rocks and substrate decor, they are taking up volume, so they do reduce your total water volume. But I will treat for the entire volume and before I start adding and during the adding of that tap water. And if you forget to treat because, again, you were distracted, you were doing something else, you had a few beers during your water change and you skipped that vital step, and your fish all of a sudden go into shock. They're shocked by the chlorine or the chloramine or whatever might be in the tap water. And of course, you can have other things too, other additives. That Safe or Prime or whatever it is you're using could have helped to offset and allowed the fish to survive it. Okay? And number 5, I call the stir-up. There's something that happens with fish after a water change. Someone once told me that a water change is a lot like the rainy season, and it creates a reaction in the fish that fires them up. And this reaction gets breeding, puts them into breeding dress, gets them very active, and if you have any weak spots in the hierarchy of your tank, let's say there's a dominant fish that has been trying to or going after or trying to eliminate another fish right after the water change, those things are turned up on high. They're stirred up. So any behaviors that were going on, even at a moderate level, are going to be all of a sudden spiked and turned up. You'll see even males pair off and go through breeding dances. You'll see all kinds of erratic behavior. You'll see fish that are normally docile all of a sudden be a bit fired up and be chasing other fish. The water change does create certain things, certain reactions in fish. Let's say you have fish in the tank that maybe shouldn't even be in there. Let's say for example you have a couple Cory cats in with some African cichlids. Chances are after a water change those Cories are going to be taken out. Let's say you have a subdominant male that a larger male considers that the subdominant male an adversary. After a water change, that larger, stronger male may inflict some injuries on that simply end up killing that subdominant male. So these kind of things can show up after a water change, and the next morning you wake up and you find one or two fish dead, and you can't figure out what happened. Well, what happened is you stirred things up with the slight temperature changes, with the drop and rise in the water levels. Something triggered in your fish, and they started demonstrating behavior that included asserting dominance, and so that is number 5. So just to summarize, number 1, the flood. That's one of the disasters in water changes that comes about usually because we stopped paying attention, we were distracted, we got off into something else. And again, my advice on that is when you do water changes, do nothing else except do the water change. Number 2, the shock, which is a shock in temperature and a shift in pH, which can be very hard on a fish, or perhaps even some X factor ingredient that was added by your municipal water treatment plant that your fish are having a very adverse reaction to. Number 3, doing too much during a water change. You cleaned your filters, you vacuumed, maybe even added a few additional fish, you killed off a lot of beneficial bacteria, you increased the bioload, you have a spike in ammonia, and all of a sudden you notice erratic behavior and a die-off in your fish following the water change. Number 4, this ties into being distracted, or simply not sticking to a routine, or just simply just forgetting. I mean, we make mistakes, we're human, and you forget to treat the water, and you add untreated water to your tank that maybe has a high amount of chlorine, and this creates a bad reaction in your fish. You start to see some red maybe around the gills, the breathing seems to be labored. The next morning you have a couple of fish that are dead, and all of a sudden you have the light goes on and you realize, oh my goodness, I didn't add safe, I didn't add prime, I simply added the water, and by then you've just had a hard knocks lesson. All right, and I like to put my water treatment right on top of the tank, somewhere very obvious, so it's right in my face. So it's going to be added either to the buckets or directly to the tank when I'm treating. I use Python systems, hoses, so I go right from tap to tank, and so I need to treat for the entire volume of the system. And like with a sump, when you consider the sump and the 150-gallon tank, I'll treat for about 170 gallons, because there is some displacement with substrate and decor and things of this nature. So it doesn't add up exactly to the total volume, but I'll treat for about 170 gallons. I'll add safe to the water as I'm adding the water from the tap, and I've never had a die-off doing it that way. And the number 5, of course, the fish become stirred up after a water change. They become fired up, and they go after other fish, and any type of a mismatch in the tank, any type of subdominant fish is at risk. And if you haven't provided hiding spots, or if you have a wrong mix of fish in your tank, it's going to show up, and you're going to end up with some fish that are killed. And this can occur after the heightened stir-up that can occur after a water change. And those are the 5. But as is usually the case, I do have a bonus one for you, and that is a failure to correctly handle the electrical components that are on your system. And by that, what I mean is you forgot to unplug the heaters, and during the water change, the water level became too low and your heater burned out on you. Or you unplugged your filters and you failed to plug them back in after the water change. And again, ask me how I know. One time I did a water change, and about 2 days later I noticed the water was looking a little bit foggy, and I realized that my filter, my FX6 canister on the 100, had been sitting there idle, and I had not plugged it back in. So again, at the end of every water change, do a visual inspection. Make sure that your heaters are plugged back in. Certainly make sure your power heads are plugged in, and of course make sure all filtration is functioning correctly.
Okay, so there you have it. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts or comments on water changes? What advice would you give somebody who's having some difficulty after a water change? What are the questions you would ask? What would you suggest? Comment below. I'd like to hear it. And that's it for me now. Thank you so much for tuning in. I got to get back to this water change right here. Thank you.